Well, hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Gracious Guest Podcast, the podcast where I, your humble host, Mike Creevy, just sort of think about what it might mean to be a gracious guest in this life. You know, you get one journey through this little marble flying through space, and how are we going to do that? What are we going to do when we're faced with challenges? How are we going to handle good news? How are we going to handle bad news? Do I take a bad day sitting down, so to speak, or do I kind of confront a day that's maybe not going so well with, a little different attitude, a little attempt to try to, recover a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism, a little bit of, the transcendent around me? And that's kind of what I do here. And if that opening introduction seems kind of strange to you, go check out the show feed and see what kinds of things I've looked at before. There's a lot of stuff about Star Wars. There's some stuff about travel. There's movie and book reviews, lessons about leadership. I mean, all sorts of different kinds of stuff. So anyways, that's what this show is about. The marvelous, the wonderful, and trying to find those things in the oftentimes mundane around us. So, interestingly enough, I stumbled across the recent phenomenon that is Jordan Peterson. Dr. Jordan Peterson, he is a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And this, actually from his Wikipedia entry here, which was citing some of his curriculum vitae and such, it says this, that his main areas of study are in abnormal social and personality psychology, with a particular interest in the psychology of religious and ideological belief, and the assessment and improvement of personality and performance. So I found out about him actually through a couple different means. My brothers had kind of encountered some of his videos and saw some interviews with him that they recommended I check out. Right around that same time, or maybe even a little before that, I had heard Dr. Peterson interviewed a couple times on Patrick Coffin's show. And Patrick Coffin was the host for, I think, 8 or 9 years, maybe 9 years, of Catholic Answers Live, which is just a really great radio program that I've listened to for years. So I kind of knew about Patrick through that and listened to some of his new stuff that he's doing on his podcast. And he had interviewed Dr. Peterson on a couple different topics that were kind of interesting. And so that's where I first found out about him. So what's interesting to me is, and I heard in those interviews that there was some controversy about him and that kind of stuff. But what's kind of funny is I'll never know, but it's sort of fun to think about how I may have processed what I was hearing about him through the media. Because if you look at headlines or you look at different media coverage of him, it's pretty shocking, actually, the way and how biased, honestly, and I think genuinely unfair or even dishonest sometimes some of it seems to be. And again, I don't know that I would have realized that if I hadn't sort of spent a good amount of time just hearing him speak, first off, just actually hearing him state some of what, the things he studied and the things he's interested in are. So because of that, and just because I was fortunate enough to encounter him sort of objectively to some degree, or at least being able to hear him, sort of straight from the horse's mouth, making some of these interviews and comments and making the case for some of his positions and that sort of thing, that when his book came out here, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, I was very intrigued. I got it for Christmas. It was given to me by my parents, and it just came out because it was just released recently. So I'm doing this podcast right now on March 4th, 2018. So it hasn't been out very long. It's a #1 seller by and large on a lot of different Amazon national sort of websites and stuff. So it's getting a lot of coverage, a lot of interest. So I thought I'd just do a very quick little overview for you today and let you know what I thought. And the book, again, it's 12 Rules for Life. He discusses in the beginning of the book why it's called that, or how the 12 rules came about. So I won't sort of ruin the backstory of it. But here are the rules, and these are the way he structures his chapters. So rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule 2, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. That was a fun chapter. Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Rule 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Rule 9, assume that the person you are listening to might know something that you don't. Rule 10, be precise in your speech. Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. And Rule 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. Okay, so if you're like me, if you first see that list, you're kind of like, what in the world? Like, where's he going to go with some of these? And indeed, it was a really interesting ride. So I just thought today I'd share a couple things I liked, then a couple things I might respectfully sort of disagree with him or challenge maybe a little bit, and then lastly just sort of overall takeaways. So first off, I highly recommend that you get this book, give it a read. It's tremendously interesting. It's an exceptionally well written book, and it's a real page turner. I hate to use that word or that phrase, but it really is. I couldn't put it down. It's over 400 pages, and I went through it in like 4 or 5 days. I just sort of blasted through the thing. It was very interesting. The scope is fascinating. It's kind of hard to say exactly what the book's about. So some of his background into, he focuses a lot on kind of Jungian archetypes and psychology, not just of Carl Jung. He talks about Freud quite a bit. Again, his expertise is in psychology, and he's a clinical psychologist. He brings in a lot of his personal experience in actually working with patients in clinical psychology, which is very, very interesting, I find. And but he talks about archetypes. He talks about, and that's one of the reasons I was interested in this sort of transcendence to a degree, if I'm not putting words in his mouth, that human beings are incredibly interesting, complex, special, unique creatures. And he really explores that quite a bit through a lot of different ways. That we're not just one animal among many. There's something extraordinarily special about every one of us and us as a species that is very mysterious. And we can know a lot, but there's a lot that's still to be discovered and assessed. And so he really, and I think in a very sort of respectful way. He's not some radical. He doesn't use really like fiery language. Some people would disagree with me on that, but I would disagree with them on what constitutes that, as opposed to making a good argument. But he really kind of takes issue with those who might kind of have a very reductionist kind of highbrow, arrogant kind of like, oh, we figured human beings out now, and here's all we are. He really what's the word I'm looking for? He does not shy away from taking that sort of viewpoint to task, and to really, pushing back a good amount against some who might make such claims. And I think he does it in a pretty courageous way, too. So with that in mind, the scope of this book is very interesting. That he moves back and forth very seamlessly from sort of the micro to the macro and back and forth, the supernatural and natural, really the big picture, and then daily practical takeaways. So he'll discuss really highfalutin, interesting, psychoanalysis type research and practical experience of that, and like a lot of the theory, but then the practical side of it, He does this a lot throughout with religion, which he's studied, and I'll come back to that a little bit too later on, because that's actually an area where I'd sort of take a little issue with him in some ways. But he also covers, understandably, then a wide variety of topics, and under those sort of 12 rules, those 12 kind of umbrellas, there's a very well-crafted overlap throughout, so that his various theses really weave together kind of in a comprehensive way. So he'll reference things, throughout the book that, were discussed earlier and bring it up in a way maybe you didn't see coming, or like, oh, wow, that's kind of an interesting argument, And what's neat about this is, as I found reading through it, like I said, I agreed with probably the overwhelming majority of what he had to say. And the things I disagreed with, though, it's a good exercise in how to have a good argument, a good logical disagreement with someone, to really try to see what someone else is trying to say, or to listen to somebody else. In fact, that's why, one of his rules was rule number 9. Assume that the person you're listening to might know something that you don't. I think that's, if you disagree with that, I don't really know what to say to you, quite frankly, other than you're just, I think, maybe buying into some of the cultural norms right now, where you just sort of assume you have somebody else figured out, and you just write somebody off because they have a different capital letter after their name in Congress, or, they look a certain way, or they have a certain religious or ideological system they adhere to that you don't. So that somehow gives you the right to just reject everything they might have to say. So ironically enough, some of the very people who espouse that kind of attitude are sometimes the very ones who are kind of trying to force everybody to be tolerant, right? Or to supposedly, be fair and loving and tolerant to everybody except the people that you disagree with, so that there's like a double standard there I think we have all encountered somewhere. And, to be fair, maybe we've been part of that, problem as well. But I think it's naive and dishonest to pretend that, you can have it both ways. So I think he makes a really good point sort of just in that topic throughout, the idea that, he's making claims, he's making certain arguments, and he's providing a tremendous amount of sort of research and reasons for why he believes what he does. And I think it's fair to hear him out, like read it, listen to it. And like I said, it's very, very courageous, I think, for him to kind of approach some of these topics. And it touches on everything from, how you raise your children, to gender theory, to all sorts of political correctness kind of, issues out there. But, it's not really about those things, or it's not a book about politics, or, it's hard to pinpoint it. And so he nests those discussions in a very, very big and important to sort of understand context, I think. So anyways, I just thought it was very thought-provoking throughout, downright courageous, as I said, that he brings up things that, not only are many of our cultural leaders and influencers not sufficiently thinking about, they don't actually think about these things, they just sort of emote. Or they just write, or, frankly, they do podcasts or videos, or, pass laws and stuff long before, sufficient amount of research or thought has even been done. And that can be very dangerous, and that's something he talks about as well. But yeah, what's interesting to me about Dr. Peterson, really, to kind of start to bring this to a close here before I mention a final thing or two, is I just think it's interesting. He's very hard for people to sort of put in a box. So we have all of these typical cataloged boxes that we have. Oh, so-and-so's liberal, so-and-so's conservative, so-and-so's alt-right, so-and-so's this, so-and-so's that. He's hard to put in a box because, for those who might be more of the liberal progressive persuasion, who might be quick to get upset about some of the things he says about sexuality, well, you really can't stick him in some sort of, templated, stereotypical, radical, conservative, American flag waving, blah, 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 like all the kinds of things you see people try to like classify. Because first of all, he's not American. He's Canadian. He's not really, he's interested in topics like that and the politics of it to the extent that it connects with our human development and our sociological, sort of, relationships and the fabric of society. But he's not really a card-carrying anything of any party or anything. But then, for those who might try to hold him up as like a paragon of conservatism, he's got some pretty liberal views on some things. He's got a lot of very interesting things to say about Christianity, a lot of very positive things. But he's not. He's very sort of ambiguous right now at where he is. And by his own admission, I really respect his honesty on this. He's not entirely comfortable saying where he's at in the sort of religious search. He's sort of a seeker. He's not really like a technically Christian, as we tend to mean that term. But I really think he might get there personally, so that's just my opinion. And that leads to something I would kind of respectfully disagree with him on. And Bishop Barron beat me to the point. I was planning this podcast all week, and then Bishop Barron put his review out before me. So I'm not saying he stole my ideas, but I definitely direct you over to Bishop Robert Barron's review and some of the comments he's made about 12 Rules. But I agree with Bishop Barron that, Peterson, as fascinating as his sort of exploration of some of the archetypical or archetype, focused aspects of the Christian faith and a lot of the themes that are in the very core of the Christian story, themes of sacrifice, of the divine becoming human. He connects a lot of these, and he sees some of these echoes throughout ancient cultures and literature all throughout the world, all over history. He sees a lot of these archetypal connections. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the Catholic Church has taught for a very long time that there are what's called seeds of the truth, or rays of light, rays of truth, throughout all religions and religious systems and across time and space throughout human history. The mistake, though, that I think that Dr. Peterson still kind of makes, or the step he's missing, as did Carl Jung in many ways, who he of course follows in a lot of regards, and Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of different religions and myths, is, again, this idea of the monomyth, which Campbell kind of dubbed it the one story that keeps cropping up in one shape or another all throughout human history. Yes, absolutely. That's awesome. That's why stories like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and Homer's Odyssey, the Aeneid, you see it, common themes show up in all of the great literature throughout human history, wherever it came up, in whatever context, no matter how widely variegated the different societies and cultures were that produced those works. But that doesn't automatically mean, though, that Christianity is just one more myth, or even the greatest myth, which I think Peterson, I gather that that's kind of his take after reading this, and I could be wrong on that, but it seems to me that he considers Christianity as sort of the greatest of the myths, the one that makes the most sense of the data, and that sort of fits the archetypes the most. But I just don't think, and this is what Bishop Barron pointed out too, I agree, I just really don't think he appreciates the historical necessity of it. That if you really get Christianity, like if the more you study it, the more you really understand just how radically different it is than any other myth or anything like that, is the absolute fundamental fact of the resurrection. It's not just a myth. It's not just a story. If it didn't happen, it's meaningless. And then Paul writes about that in the New Testament. He says, if Jesus Christ is not truly risen from the dead, we are of all men to be pitied. So this we see this very commonly. It's a very, very common thing these days, especially, and has been for a while. That I want to, I'll be quote unquote Christian, or I'll just sort of respect Christianity for its moral system or for its contributions to nonviolence and whatever. But whether or not it's true, well, that doesn't really matter somehow. It can be just as true as Buddhism or just as true as Hinduism. It just can't. It is literally meaningless if it's just one more system, because it's the only one of these systems. It's the only religion, anything like it, that is entirely built on historical fact that was claimed to have eyewitnesses, people who went to their deaths to proclaim it, that it was the truth. And Jesus himself says, he doesn't say, I am a way, a truth, a life. He says, I am the way, the truth, the life. He says, no one comes to the Father except through me. So anyways, I mean, I of course, to back off a little bit, I don't expect, Jordan Peterson to write about those sorts of things specifically, I mean, that's not really his expertise, but, he does talk about it quite a bit. He really digs in, and that's been something he's been doing for the last year or so, has been a psychological exploration of the Bible and characters in the Bible, which is a fascinating study. And I, hope and pray for him that through that work, he might be able to encounter the total otherliness of the Christian thing, as opposed to just one more, rehashing of archetypes, through literature and stuff like that. And so bottom line, the Catholic understanding of this has always been that all of those seeds of truth, all of those little echoes, the archetypes that we do see in literature throughout the world, and the human storytelling experience, these transcendent things that transcend time and culture and all of those considerations, it's not that Christianity was just one more of those, but rather that God, who made everything in the universe, built those little echoes into the fabric of human society way, 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 way back when, so that when he would conduct his final act of redemption, cultures, peoples from all over the world would be able to have an aha moment. There would be these doorways into various cultures and languages that he already put there and programmed there ahead of time to facilitate the planting and the growing and the nourishing of the gospel message among peoples all over the world. So that's a very different kind of thing, obviously, and that requires a different kind of conversation. But overall, I loved this book. It's fascinating. It's especially good, I think, for young men to read. It's for everybody, I'd say. But we live in a time when, there's like this unspoken, guilt trip almost, or shame sometimes at even thinking that there's something special about being a man, that there are things we should do, things that we should experience as men to help us grow into the role of being a real man. And I even hesitate to use the word role because that's one of the words that's sort of like used to pretend that masculinity and femininity are somehow just constructs, without ever really offering any sufficient proof of that claim, when all the proof seems to be to the contrary, certainly our experience, So anyways, that's a big theme. It's not like one of the only themes. That's the one he tends to get in trouble for the most, because it's very dangerous to say things like that today, no matter how true it is. But at any rate, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos by Dr. Jordan Peterson. Very interesting, psychologically, sociologically, the scientific aspect of it all throughout, and all the research he talks about on almost every page. Really very interesting, quite compelling in a lot of ways, especially on this idea of the mysterious and marvelous nature of the human experience and how very different it really is and how special it is. So we are deeply complex and incredible creatures, utterly unique. And I think if there's one takeaway among others, I really think that was a very interesting and special one personally. So I couldn't recommend it more. 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, Dr. Jordan Peterson. There's a link for the book. You can get it over on Amazon. Audiobook is great. I actually listened to the audiobook because he reads it, which is pretty cool. So if you go over there on Audible, not only do you get to get the content of his book, you get to hear him read it, which is pretty sweet too. Great Canadian accent. So at any rate, I am Mike Creevy, host of The Gracious Guest Show, sharing with you today this review, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Check out the podcast feed over there. Subscribe if you're not subscribed already over on iTunes or Pocket Casts. Tell your friends about the show. I really want to get the word spread. Hopefully this can help people out just with life in general, and having some of these fun conversations and taking time to do that in our busy days. So thanks so much for tuning in. Hit me up over on the website too, thegraciousguest.org. So until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.